This is Frankly MSP, where managed service providers get real.
Hey, and welcome to episode 46 of Frankly MSP, the podcast for managed service providers who want to boost their productivity, efficiency, and profitability. I'm your host, Jennifer Tribe. Do you have a dedicated service dispatcher on your team? Chances are good that you don't. Yet, anyway. But Erick Simpson is here to talk about why a dedicated dispatcher is well worth the investment for your MSP, how to know when you're ready to make that hire, and best practices for the role. Erick Simpson is a former MSP who now consults with IT service providers and channel vendors all over the world. He worked at Microsoft for a time, helping to educate and engage Microsoft partners. He's served on advisory councils to the likes of Cisco, Intel, CompTIA. For a number of years, he ran something called MSP University. So Erick is very, very well versed in the channel and has lots of great insights to share with us today. Side note, Erick will be one of our speakers at Frankly MSP Live in January 2020. If you don't have your tickets yet, I recommend grabbing them soon. You can buy them at franklymsplive.com. My chat with Erick is coming up later in the show, but first, our One Thing segment, where we hear from an MSP about one thing that's made a difference in their business. Today, we have Neil Holme, owner of Impact Business Technology.
I am Neil Holme. I am the founder and chief geek for Impact Business Technology. My one thing is about how you go about your business. You should design, you should build, you should maintain and support every network as if it's a showcase of your talents. And by this, I mean, you work on this network maybe once a week, once a month if you're lucky, but your clients see this every single day. And you don't want a little thing that you've left behind or left something messy or didn't quite complete right to linger and to fester with them. You want everything to be as good as it can possibly be the first time around. This has always been the approach that we've had. Our business grows 100% by referral. We don't have any outside sales. We don't do any marketing. So every one of our installations, like I say, is a showcase. If one of my customers has a friend or a colleague that is having problems with their computer, first thing I want my customer to think of is, you should call our guys. They're awesome. And that's where we put all of our efforts, all of our additional time and resources is into making our customer systems as good as they can possibly be. A well-designed network, a well-built network, and a well-maintained network generates fewer support calls. So we operate a 24/7 help desk. Every time a customer calls me, it's costing me money. So if we can minimize that by building the network right, maintaining it right, and keeping it neat, it reduces the number of support calls, and it also makes troubleshooting and maintaining that network simpler, easier, and quicker. So it reduces costs across the board.
You're listening to Frankly MSP, brought to you by Auvik Networks.
This wasn't a tip that I'd heard before, and when I asked Neil about it, he says, yeah, he shares that advice a fair bit, and that's always the response that he gets, that MSPs haven't really thought about doing things that way. As thanks for that great tip, I'll be sending Neil a Frankly MSP t-shirt. You could get a t-shirt too. Just tell us what your one thing is. Send me an email at franklymsp@auvik.com with your voice recording, or shoot me an email at the same address and let me know what time you'd like to record over the phone. It's that easy. Now we come to my chat with Erick Simpson about the importance of a dedicated dispatcher on your service desk. Hi, Erick. Welcome to Frankly MSP.
Hi, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, excited to have you here. Of course, you have many topics that you consult and speak on, but today we're going to be talking about the role of a dispatcher in an MSP. So let's start with a discussion of what is the dispatch role and why is it so important?
Well, Jennifer, the dispatch role is a vital role within a service provider's organization because that role holds the responsibility in the best case scenario for lifecycle management of every incident that comes in to the service desk, also manages scheduling and rescheduling service delivery, and is responsible for maintaining the SLA. In many cases, IT providers, when they start their organizations or begin their practices, They allow the engineers and technicians to cherry pick tickets out of the service board. And as you well know, when we're having a bad day, we kind of tend to take the easy things and maybe not really work on the things that we should be working on, or may take longer than necessary to execute incident management and problem management. And so it's the dispatcher's responsibility to manage that entire process, be responsible for ticket load and distributing tickets and load balancing between the teams, making sure that escalation is working properly so that we're achieving our service delivery KPIs, and also making sure that we're adhering to SLA. So without that critical role, a dedicated service dispatcher, it's almost like the Wild Wild West. Everybody's kind of doing what they think they should be doing, and no one really is monitoring and measuring performance. So if we have 3 technicians or engineers in level 1 on the service desk, no one's watching to see who's performing the best and who's not performing up to that capacity and determining why that might be. Is it a training issue? Is it a process issue? Is something else going on that's hampering our ability to provide consistent service? This also speaks to the ability to tier most effectively and categorize the type of incidents that are coming into the service desk. Without the ability to measure how long it takes to manage these incidents, it's tough to really staff and scale the service desk overall.
What do you see as the difference between a dispatcher and a service desk manager?
Well, a service desk manager is ultimately responsible for all service delivery. Service dispatcher is a more focused role around coordinating the service delivery, typically around the service desk and around on-site support. So while the service manager may also be responsible for the service dispatcher's performance, they're typically also responsible for project managers, program managers, and things like that. So really the highest level of management before we start getting into C-level executives and things like that.
Now, do you see this as being necessary as a distinct role on the team, or is this something that you could rotate through different engineers or job share?
You know, I've worked with a lot of partners in my career, and ultimately the most effective and most successful service desks have a dedicated dispatch role, if not multiple dispatchers focused on perhaps different areas of service delivery. But as we're building out our practices, I have seen partners kind of rotate that role around. It's not the most efficient ultimately, but it's a stepping stone toward moving in the right direction.
So how big do you think an MSP needs to be before a dedicated dispatcher makes economic sense?
Well, I think it makes sense to really start looking at dedicated dispatch role when you get to 70 to 100 tickets per day, depending upon how you've scaled out your service desk team. I think the sooner the better, but ultimately the service dispatcher's role is really what I call an air traffic controller's job. So the more tickets that are coming in, it's kind of like birds in the air. They're tracking and identifying what type of tickets those are, what service boards or queues or individuals to assign those to, and then making sure that the tickets are flowing properly. When we staff our service desks, the vast majority of incidents that we receive should be level 1 incidents. Now, these are incidents that should be handled within 45 minutes or less if we can get there. And this gives us an idea of how to categorize our tickets so that we can assign those tickets to the largest team that we have on our services, which should be level 1. So if 90 to 93% of our tickets are level 1 incidents, then that leaves about 4 to 5% kind of escalating to level 2, and then the balance of 2 to 3% in the best case scenario being level 3. And it's the dispatcher's job really to manage that distribution and to ensure that we are able to close the number of tickets we need to on a daily basis. If a level 1 technician should close tickets within 45 minutes, let's say, they should be able to close 12 tickets a day. If they can close tickets within 30 minutes, they should be able to close 16 tickets a day. So there's a formula around how we staff and tier our service desk team, and how much we can rely on these individuals themselves to kind of police themselves and self-dispatch So I think the sooner we can get a dispatcher in there when it makes economic sense, the better, because it's going to increase our efficiencies. It's going to increase client satisfaction. And again, it allows that visibility and reporting against KPIs to really manage the performance of the service desk in general, each tier or level in the service desk, and each individual technician and engineer.
Now, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. Could some of what the dispatcher does be achieved through smart automation? So using triage tools and routing logic?
Well, I think there's no easy answer to that. The more that we leverage automation to identify, categorize, assign, and alert and escalate incidents, the better off we are. But ultimately, what happens when a ticket is assigned to a technician and they simply don't respond to it? I do a lot of work in helping partners optimize their PSA solutions and RMM solutions. And, one of the biggest things that happens is, hey, the system is doing what it's supposed to do when it's configured properly and assigning these tickets to these queues. But again, the human element is what we're managing here, not the application. So it may be assigning tickets to engineers and technicians, but if they're selectively choosing what they work on and taking longer than they should to work on issues and working on the wrong issues, then the system is not going to really help us there. We really need some oversight.
So what kind of person, what kind of skill set makes a good dispatcher?
Great question. So going back to my analogy of being the air traffic controller, this individual doesn't have to be highly technical, but they do need to be kind of a master of space and time. That means they've got to be very, very organized. They've got to be very schedule oriented. They've got to be able to identify issues quickly and assign and reassign tickets to load balance between individual technicians and escalate to other tiers and have oversight over that. And we can automate the escalation and alerting process. But again, ultimately, when everyone is responsible for managing their own tickets, then no one's responsible. So they've got to have that responsibility and own it. That's why the importance of the service dispatcher is so high, because we have to have one person that's ultimately responsible for the performance of that unit. Otherwise, it's kind of the wild, wild west.
Is this a role that you could have remotely? So, working with someone who works from home or calls in instead of in the office, or do you think it's important for them to be there in person?
I do have partners that have a remote dispatch role operating, but in my opinion, it's better to have them in the mix, in the bullpen, because, and especially if they're not highly technical. I remember when I was running my MSP practice, we had a part-time dispatcher at first as we grew into that role. And this was a person that was going to college, and they had no technical experience at all. But by the time they graduated college and started full-time as the dispatcher, that grew over, and that was pretty quick. It was probably within the same year they were graduating. They became much more technically adept because they were in the bullpen with the teams, and the technicians were helping them improve their ability to dispatch. So, hey, I have this kind of a ticket here. Should it go to Tom or Adrian? And they would help the dispatcher improve to the point where they actually then migrated to become a level 1 service desk technician. So I think there's a lot of value in having them in the environment as they're working with the team.
You said this part-time dispatcher was a college student. So is this a good role for sort of like an entry-level person, someone who wants to get their feet wet in the technical industry?
It depends on what the goal of that individual is. If they want to become a dragon-slaying engineer, I probably wouldn't start them off in the dispatch role. This is something that does not require, again, the highest level of technical competency. I mean, you've got to be adept at what you're doing. You have to understand the types of incidents that we're receiving and where they should go and how to manage time and space, as I mentioned, calendaring and load balancing and things like that. But that role really isn't going to be building servers and virtualizing environments and working in the cloud and security and things like that. So if someone really wants that as their career, I would start them off in a more technical role than a dispatch role.
Let's shift now to talking about some of the tools that a dispatcher would use on a day-to-day basis.
Sure. Typically, they're working within the provider's ticketing system or professional services automation system. So whatever the application is that is being used to manage incidents and tickets and projects and things like that, because a lot of times the same resources that are working level 1, 2, or 3 tickets are also being deployed to work on projects and things like that. As an IT organization grows and evolves and becomes more mature, we tend to start dedicating resources to project deployment and project management and things like that. But when we're smaller organizations, we tend to be using everyone. So when there's a project that needs to be prepped or even deployed on site, sometimes that dispatcher has to be able to allocate the resources that they're using for incident management to those projects as well. So there's a calendaring function that comes into play there. And so now the dispatcher is working within the incident management or trouble ticketing system, the service boards and queues, but they may also be working within the project management module, making sure that they're allocating time to support those projects with the same resources and working with the project manager or project coordinator as a team to make that happen.
Let's talk about a few dispatcher best practices. So let's say there's someone who's new in the role. What are the first handful of things that they should really focus on getting under control?
Great question. So I think in order to prepare for the role, a couple of things that the dispatcher needs to be trained on, number one, are the applications, the PSA solution, the ticketing system, the project module, if they're also going to assist in scheduling for projects and things like that. They have to really understand how those applications work. The next thing they need to understand is, I would say, the top 10 types of incidents to fast start somebody in the role. What are the top 10 types of incidents that we receive? And then how do we assign those? So what is our SLA? What types of issues are level 1, level 2, level 3? And then also to have an understanding of tiers in the service desk. So who sits in each tier and what are their capabilities? In many cases, a level 3 engineer or tier 3 engineer is not someone that sits in the service desk, and maybe not even a level 2. They may be out doing more high value deployments or services in the field and things like that, and they get escalated tickets that fall out of the scope or time out from a level 1 perspective. Remember, the intent of level 1 is to churn through as many tickets as possible. And if they're supposed to close a ticket every 45 minutes, if we don't escalate those tickets out of there, then they'll start working on tickets too long, and that'll reduce their performance. So there's a sensitivity around how to manage those and how to escalate those out. So understanding everyone's capabilities, where tickets should go, and then ultimately how their performance is being measured, right? So what are the KPIs that we're measuring on the service desk? What's the utilization and realization targets that we want for the service desk and every tier in the service desk, as well as every technician? So obviously this is a lot to learn and become adept at, but it happens over a pretty rapid period of time, I would say.
Now, what's your experience been? I mean, I know you travel extensively. You're at a lot of events talking to many MSPs. What's your experience? Do most MSPs have a dispatcher? Do most not have a dispatcher?
I'll answer that question this way. I think the more mature MSPs and the higher performing or best in class MSPs will have a dispatcher. So I think it's a natural evolution. Ultimately, we build an IT organization over time. We start staffing it with dedicated resources over time. We may not have a dedicated sales professional when we just start an MSP practice, but over time as we mature, we begin hiring those folks. I think a dispatcher and dedicated project manager, dedicated sales engineer, these are roles that typically are more costly for the organization, but when we can support their hiring and those roles, it makes sense then to bring them on board, because then they can help increase efficiencies and productivity and become a profit center over time rather than a cost center.
Anything else that you want MSPs to take away about the topic of dispatch?
What I would suggest is, if you're really looking to get a handle on improving your service desk efficiencies and evolve into a organization that is measuring performance and outputs and running the service desk and other business units by the numbers, then take a hard look at how your service desk tickets and incidents are being assigned and really consider when is the right time to hire a service dispatcher. Again, if you're receiving north of 70 tickets a day, I would say really take a hard look and understand that there are going to be value on the investment that a service dispatcher brings that you're not cognizant of at the time. But that role will pay for itself very, very quickly.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Eric.
Thanks for having me, Jennifer. Appreciate it.
That was Erick Simpson, channel speaker, author, and consultant. Are you getting ready to hire a dispatcher? Are you working your way up to a full-time dispatcher with maybe job sharing or rotation or a part-time person? I'd love to hear what you're doing in this area. So hop on over to the show notes at avik.com/franklymsp/046 and let us know. The show notes are also where I'll put Erick's contact information and links to any resources we discussed. A reminder that if you liked this conversation with Erick, that he'll be one of our featured speakers at Frankly MSP Live in January 2020. That's in Santa Barbara, California. You can grab your tickets for that at franklymsplive.com. And that's a wrap. Till next time, this is Jennifer Tribe. Thanks for listening.
Frankly MSP, brought to you by Avik Networks, the most efficient and profitable way to manage your clients' networks.